The objective of the Zen way of life is the experience of awakening or enlightenment, i.e., insight, we should say in current psychological jargon, in which man escapes from the paralysis, the double bind, in which the dualistic idea of self control and self consciousness involves him. In this experience, man overcomes his feeling of dividedness or separateness, not only from himself as the higher controlling self against the lower controlled self, but also from the total universe of other people and things. The interest of Zen is that it provides a uniquely simple and classical example of a way of recognizing and dissolving the conflict or contradiction of self-consciousness. The student of Zen is confronted by a master who has himself experienced awakening, and is in the best sense of the expression a completely natural man. For the adept in Zen is one who manages to be human with the same artless grace and absence of inner conflict with which a tree is a tree. Such a man is likened to a ball in a mountain stream, which is to say that he cannot be blocked, stopped, or embarrassed in any situation. He never wobbles or dithers in his mind, for though he may pause in overt action to think a problem out, the stream of his consciousness always moves straight ahead without being caught in the vicious circles of anxiety or indecisive doubt, wherein thought whirls wildly around without issue. He is not precipitate or hurried in action, but simply continuous. This is what Zen means by being detached, not being without emotion or feeling, but being one in whom feeling is not sticky or blocked, and through whom the experiences of the world pass like the reflections of birds flying over water. Although possessed of complete inner freedom, he is not, like the libertine, in revolt against social standards, nor, like the self-righteous, trying to justify himself. He is all of a piece with himself and with the natural world, and in his presence you feel that without strain or artifice, he is completely all here, sure of himself without the slightest trace of aggression. He is thus the grand seigneur, the spiritual aristocrat, comparable to the type of worldly aristocrat who is so sure of the position given to him by birth that he has no need to condescend or put on airs. Confronted by such an example, the ordinary Zen student feels totally uncouth and ill at ease, particularly because his situation as student requires him to try to respond to the master with the same unhesitating and unself-conscious naturalness. Worse still, the gambits to which he must respond are koans, or problem questions, which are designed to plunk him straight into double-bind situations. A typical koan is, "Show me your original face, which you had before your father and mother conceived you." Show me, in other words, your genuine, deepest self, not the self which depends on family and conditioning, on learning or experience, or any kind of artifice. Obviously, a consciously planned and thought-out answer will not do, for this will spring from the student's culturally conditioned ego, from the personal role which he is playing. Thus, no deliberate or willed response will answer the problem, since this will show only the acquired self. On the other hand, the only alternative under the circumstances will be for the student to try to make a response which is wholly spontaneous and unpremeditated. But here is the double bind. Just try to be natural. But this is the blind leading the blind, for the mind that needs to be controlled is the one that does the controlling. Thought is trying to drive out thought. At this moment there is a sudden flash of psychological lightning. What should have been obvious all the time has leaped into full clarity, and the student runs to his master, and without the least difficulty shows him his original face. What happened? All this time the student had been paralyzed by the ingrained conviction that he was one thing, and his mind, or thoughts, or sensations, another. Thus, when faced with himself, he had always felt split in two, unable to show himself all of a piece, without contradiction. But now, it has suddenly become a self-evident feeling that there is no separate thinker who has, or who controls the thoughts. Thinker and thoughts are the same. After all, if you begin to let your mind think what it likes, the next moment it wants to interfere with itself. So let it do that. So long as you let it think what it wants at each successive moment, there is absolutely no effort, no difficulty in letting it go. But the disappearance of the effort to let go is precisely the disappearance of the separate thinker, of the ego trying to watch the mind, without interfering. Now there is nothing to try to do, for whatever comes up moment by moment is accepted, including not accepting. For a second the thinker seems to be responding to the flow of thought with the immediacy of a mirror image, and then suddenly it dawns that there is no mirror and no image. There is simply the flow of thought, one after another without interference, and the mind really knows itself. There is no separate mind which stands aside and looks at it. Furthermore, when the dualism of thinker and thought disappears, so does that of subject and object. The individual no more feels himself to be standing back from his sensations of the external world, just as he is no longer a thinker standing back from his thoughts. He therefore has a vivid sense of himself as identical with what he sees and hears, so that his subjective impression comes into accord with the physical fact that man is not so much an organism in an environment as he is an organism-environment relationship. The relationship is, as it were, more real than its two terms, somewhat as the inner unity of a stick is more solid than the difference of its two ends. The human being who has realized this unity is no longer a trap set to catch himself, for self-consciousness is no more a state of being in two minds, which, fortuitously enough, also means a state of indecision and dither and psychic paralysis. This is what self-consciousness becomes when we try to handle it dualistically, taking as real the conventions of thought and speech which separate I from myself, as well as mind from body, spirit from matter, knower from known. In separation, the self I know is never the one I need to know, and the one I control is never the one I need to control. Politically, this dualism is manifest in the separation of the government or the state from the people, which occurs in every democracy, a supposedly self-governing community. But governments and states have to exist when people have no inner feeling of their solidarity with others, when human society is nothing more than an abstract term for a collection of individuals, divided from each other because each one is divided from himself. In the Eastern world, Zen and other means of setting man free from his own clutches have been the concern only of small minorities. In the West, where we believe in, or are at least committed to, the dissemination of knowledge to all, we have no Zen masters with whom to study. Yet in this way, we may have an advantage, for the separation of master from student is another form of the duality of the controller and the controlled, which, obviously, would not have to exist if the organism environment called man were truly self-controlling. This is why, in Zen, the master does not actually teach the student anything, but forces him to find out for himself, and furthermore, does not think of himself as a master, since it is only from the standpoint of the unawakened student that there are masters. We are forced to find out for ourselves, not by masters, but by their absence, so that there is no temptation for us to lean on others. It is true that the Japanese Zen student has the presence of the master's naturalness to embarrass him, but cannot we be embarrassed by our very natural environment of sky, earth, and water, as by the marvel of our own bodies, into making a response, into acting in a way that is commensurate with their splendor? Or must we continue to buffet them blindly with bulldozers, fancying ourselves as the independent controllers and conquerors of what is, after all, the greater and perhaps better half of ourselves? It is not my purpose here, nor is it really in the spirit of this whole point of view, to indicate the specific things which should be done to bring about some technological application of this new feeling of man's relation to nature, both within and without his organism. For what is important is not the particular things to be done, but the attitude, the inner feeling and disposition of the doer. What is needed is not a new kind of technique, but a new kind of man. For as an old Taoist text says, when the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. And the task of developing a new kind of man is not as difficult as it seems once we are disabused of the idea that self-change and self-control are no more a matter of conflict between higher and lower natures, of good intentions against recalcitrant instincts. The problem is to overcome the ingrained disbelief in the power of winning nature by love, in the gentle way of turning with the skid, of controlling ourselves by cooperating with ourselves.